to the question, is atheism immoral? As the Christian in this debate, I naturally have the affirmative. And so I want to hasten to clarify what form of this I would want to defend and what form of it I would not defend. All right. So that question, is atheism immoral, can be construed in different ways. And I am more than eager to defend one form of it and not at all eager to defend forms of it that I would regard as silly or inconsequential. Of course, so a few qualifiers on what I do not mean. Given, of course, as a Christian, given that God exists, to deny that he does would be a sin, and hence an immoral position, right? So if it's true that God exists and we owe everything to him and he loves us and we're saying, I don't think you're there, of course, that's a sin, and hence immoral. But I'm not taking our question in that sense, because that's, at one level, that would be like asking, is atheism atheistic? Right? It'd be tautological. It'd be a debate about nothing. So I don't take the question in that way. Rather, I believe the question has to do with whether atheism is a greenhouse that grows levels of accepted immorality that surpass the levels that the human race has always been able to produce. So wherever the human race goes, you're going to find all kinds of gaudy misbehavior. And you're going to find a sort of baseline of human sinfulness, human wickedness, human iniquity. And you're going to find it among Buddhists and among Hindus and among Muslims and among Christians. Every culture under the sun, including the Christian ones, has had to grapple with and deal with the fact of human frailty, human sinfulness, human problems. So I'm taking this as, is atheism something that takes it to the next level? I can't argue that atheism is immoral because atheists have been known to sin, because everybody does. Right? That wouldn't prove anything. So, is atheism a greenhouse that grows these things to a level that is out of the ordinary? If sins were pumpkins, does atheism produce prize winners for the state fair? Does atheism produce really big pumpkins? And I believe, actually, the answer to that question is yes. But I think you have to zoom out and look at the big picture. And that leads to the next qualifier. I'm not maintaining, for example, that if I lived next door to Ben and my wife and I were going on vacation, that his atheism would somehow require him, as soon as we disappeared around the corner, to run over and burn down my house. I don't believe that is what we're discussing. I don't believe that. No, I'm sure we'd get along fine, and that he would be happy to take in our mail and so on. And I can also, in my thought experiment, come up with certain Christians that I wouldn't want to ask to take in my mail, that I wouldn't get along with as well. So, in certain respects, if we're talking about public morality or how you behave in your interactions with other people, we also have to reckon with the bell curve, which is the fact, if I say something like men are taller than women, I'm dealing with two bell curves, and I can easily produce certain women who are taller than certain men, and thus my generalization is falsified, but it's not really falsified because it was a generalization. So I believe that atheistic cultures, atheistic societies do get to hellish levels of immorality, but I don't believe that that's the case for individual atheists necessarily at all. So I'm not maintaining that. So in what sense would I want to argue that atheism is immoral? There are three things that I would like to mention, and to anticipate Ben's reference to motivation is my third one. So there's two things that I want to tag first as more important, but motivation is my third point, and it, I think, is an important one, but just not the most important one. The first thing I want to mention is that we have a need for God in order to have a fixed definition of morality, a fixed definition of morality. If there is no God, and Darwin is right, then morality must evolve right along with us. There were things that we used to be able to do back when we were eels. There are things we used to be able to do when we were crustaceans. There were things that we could do that we can't do now because the species evolves and the morality, the accepted canons of behavior evolve right along with us. What we currently call moral, and I put that in scare quotes, what we currently call moral is no more fixed than the fins that we used to have or the antenna that we will have someday. The fins that we used to have are all gone now, and our morality that we had back then is gone also, and the morality that we currently have is going to be gone when we get to the antenna stage. So the need for a shared definition of morality is crucial in a debate like this, because what will happen at some point if I point to abortion or to same-sex marriage or to statist thieveries, and I say, well, of course, atheism produces pro-abortion legislation and produces openness to any kind of marriage you want to have, and it produces, I'm sure I could develop my list or extend my list of immoral offenses, and if I get it long enough, then Ben's going to interrupt and say something like, those things aren't immoral. What are you talking about? Well, clearly, what I'm talking about at that point is we have different definitions of morality. So our understanding of morality might overlap somewhat, but you have to start with definitions. And I think definitions come back to, on things like morality, come back to the two great playground questions of why and who says, right? Why and who says. So next, the second thing that I want to get to is the need for a rationale. So the first is the definition. How do we define what is moral and immoral? The second is the need for a rationale for morality. And in this case, for any kind of morality at all, whether it's Ben's or mine's or somebody else. By this, I mean any system that says to an individual, you ought to do thus and such. If there's a thou shalt not, if you're out of line for doing this, you ought to have done otherwise. If a system comes from outside the individual and says you ought to do this, then somebody's going to say, why? Who says? Why and who says? Where does that ought come from? Where does that ought come from? Where do we get obligation? What produces obligation? Moral, and specifically moral obligation. What is its basis? So let us postulate that Ben and I have a friend in common. Okay, we have a friend in common, and he is a man who's a dedicated atheist. He's on his deathbed, and Ben and I arrive at the same time to say our farewells to him. This friend takes the opportunity to tell the two of us that he lived as he pleased, and that, speaking quite frankly now, since he's going to die later that day, he has gotten away with a bunch of stuff. Let's say that he then mentions a line of atrocities that he's committed, and that Ben and I are both appalled by the things he's done. All right, so Ben and I don't have any difference at all about our disapproval of what this guy's behavior has been. We both disapprove of it. The issue of the rationale comes in when our friend passes away, and Ben and I are standing out on his front lawn about to go our respective ways, and we get to talking about why we disapprove. Okay, why do we disapprove? Why was this guy wrong? All right, so the issue is not whether it's possible, and this is something that Ben alluded to in his opening statement. The issue is not whether it's possible for this friend to have been a Kantian or to have been a utilitarian. That's true. He could have been those things, just as Ben can be those things. But as it turned out, as it happened, what he actually was a nihilist. What he actually was someone who said, I'm going to do absolutely whatever I want to. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us. I'm going to do as I please. My question is not whether Ben makes room for the Kantian and utilitarian and other forms of atheism that hold to an objective morality. My question is whether he has room for the nihilist who lives that way. Is that consistent also? Okay. Now, then that leads to the third thing. The third thing has to do with the motivation. So the first is, how do we define morality? And I think we can realize that on a number of fundamental issues, the Christian and the atheist would define it very, very differently. The second thing is how, if we have an area of shared agreement on these things our deceased friend did that we both disapprove of, what is our rationale for disapproving of it? And can we say that this selfish man who just passed away was in any way wrong? Who did he sin against? What did he violate? He did get away with it. He got clean away with it. But then third is motivation for living morally. And this is reflected a little bit in my scenario of the man on the deathbed. The human race is a piece of work. We do all kinds of awful things to one another. And because we do awful things to one another, we need encouragement. We need help. We need to realize that we are not the fine beings that we like to flatter ourselves that we are. And one of the things that is a motivating factor is the reality of justice, not justice as an abstraction, but justice as in judgment coming. So when a person lives his life in the fear of God, not fear in the sense of scared, but fear in the sense of an awesome respect for who God is, and the realization that we are all going to appear before the judgment seat of God, and we're going to answer for how we lived. This is a graded course. Now, oftentimes, anybody who wants to tell you that students behave in exactly the same way in pass-fail courses that they do in graded courses hasn't been teaching very long. People behave differently. And if you convince the population, if you convince the entire population that there is no accountability, there are no final grades, there is no day of judgment, there are many people who have lived lives of unbridled selfishness and who got clean away with it. If you convince them that that's the way it is, there will be a number of people who will aspire to that. And when they aspire to that, the atheist is not in a position to say, you're making a wrong choice. Says who? Why is that a wrong choice? All right, I'm good there.
Thank you very much. We'll jump into the open conversation. Want to let you know, folks, we are on podcast. If you didn't know, we're really excited about it. We've gotten a lot of positive feedback. And so pull out your favorite podcast app and see if you can find us. And also want to let you know, if you're listening via podcast right now, our guests are linked in the description of the podcast as well. And so you can hear plenty more from our guests by clicking on those links in the description. And with that, we'll kick it over to the open discussion portion. And so thanks, gentlemen. The floor is all yours.
Yeah, so there's a lot going on there. So one of the first claims was that there's going to be a certain amount of immorality in any human society, but that you're going to get more immorality given widespread atheism. Now that's an empirical claim, so that's actually testable. We don't just have to speculate about it. And granted, the experiments that we have are not laboratory pristine. Because there are other factors that confound it, but it is striking that they don't seem to bear out what Pastor Douglas is predicting here. That so if you look at the countries in the world with the highest rate of irreligion, you'll see places like Sweden and Denmark that also have much lower rates of things like murder and rape than the United States, which is one of the most religious countries in the first world. Of course, as I said,
why'd you leave out the Soviet Union?
Well, we can talk about the Soviet Union too, but first let's talk about Sweden and Denmark. And of course, I think that this is not a pristine laboratory experiment because they have a lot more irreligion than we do, but they also have more of what you referred to earlier as statist thievery, which I take it means redistributive taxation, welfare state, stuff like that.
All that bad stuff.
Yeah. Well, I tend to. I won't blame your Christianity for your having that opinion. There is a long and honorable list of Christians who disagree with you, so at the very least, we can say that if it is a greenhouse of immorality, I don't think that there's any evidence that it is. But if it is a greenhouse of immorality, then at least the version of that greenhouse that's combined with lots of statist thievery and social welfare seems to be one that grows much smaller pumpkins than we get in countries like the United States. And I'd also point out, of course, that if we're going to talk about the state fair winners, this is, obviously the list of religious immoral, winners in the state fair of immorality is very long and presumably doesn't need to be recited here.
So let me start with that and then work back to Denmark and Sweden and so on. Let's take a famous Christian atrocity that really was an atrocity, the Spanish Inquisition. Okay, take something like the Spanish Inquisition, which was horrible, offensive to God, bad, wicked. I'll call it every name you want me to call it. But the Spanish Inquisition, over the course of its history, was responsible for about 2,000 executions. That was Stalin on a slow afternoon. Okay, so basically, when we're looking at the iniquity of atheistic regimes, I'm thinking of places like North Korea, Soviet Union, godless places. And when I go to places like Scandinavia, this is where my point about the definition of morality comes into play, because the Scandinavians are immoral in a different way than the Soviets were. So you're likely, if I went to Scandinavia and said, does their godlessness have anything to do with pornography use? Okay, the answer is yes, but I think it would be much, much less likely that a Swede would run over and burn down my house. The Soviets would take me out of my house, burn down my house, and send me off to the gulag because I was thinking, thoughts that I ought not to think. So there's oppressive, violent iniquity, but there are also forms of immorality that are not rapacious, that are not violent. Sweden hasn't invaded anybody lately. They're not running concentration camps, but that doesn't mean that there's no immorality there, right? So this goes back to the question of definition.
Your initial example about the kind of immorality you're most likely to get in Sweden, and you brought up use of pornography and said that we could attribute that to their atheism. Again, I think the empirical data doesn't really back that up. The two states in the United States that have the highest rates of porn download are Mississippi and Utah. And I don't think that those are the two states with the highest rate of atheists. So I think that, again, whether the state fair results actually correlate with your prediction, I'm not convinced of. Now we could talk about the Soviet Union and the atrocities, that were committed under Stalin, which are certainly very real. But one problem with that is that if what we're going to focus on there as the problem is the fact that that Stalin's particular ideology wasn't a religious ideology, that that the governing party was atheistic, then you have a problem, because Nazi Germany committed much worse atrocities, and their governing ideology was not atheistic. The most evil system that's ever existed in the history of the human race, chattel slavery in the American South, was one that was overseen by people who certainly saw themselves as Bible Bible believing Christians. So I think that this claim that just even in terms of correlation, I think that this claim that we could say where there's atheism, then you're going to see more atrocities or worse morality. I think certainly, at least given that fragment of morality that we agree on, I think is going to be pretty dubious. I think that the problem with Stalin's Russia was not the fact that the governing party happened to be atheistic. It was the lack of political democracy and legal institutions that would stop the governing party from doing those things, which is not something that's a product of atheism. I mean, if anything, the struggle for democracy globally is something that had to contend against many centuries of Christian theology justifying, absolute monarchy. But I don't want to spend too long on this, because you mentioned 3 points, and I think they're all important. So I mean, unless you have more you want to say about this, I would like to.
Well, let me ask you one question about it. One question, sure. Then we can go back to my 3 points, and sure. I want to get to your Euthyphro issue also. Let's say you and I, let's say our deathbed friend, not that you or I would be friends with him, but let's say our deathbed friend was Stalin, and he's going to die in 15 minutes, and we're talking to him, and he says to us, "Well, I got away with it." How is he wrong?
He's not wrong that he got away with it. He is wrong if he thinks that means that it's fine. I think a really useful way to think about this, because those seems like there are two very different issues that are being conflated here. Whether he had a self-interested reason not to do what he did, and whether he had a moral reason not to do what he did. In fact, normally we think, I think.
But why does he have a moral obligation to be a Kantian or a utilitarian? Why can't he be what he was? Why isn't that one of the options?
Well, sure. It's to the extent that it's an option. It's equally an option if you're a theist. That there's absolutely nothing about theism that makes that any less of an option. Any argument that I can give for Kantianism, utilitarianism, Rawlsianism, any of those options, any argument I can give against moral nihilism doesn't gain anything if you say, "Oh, and also God exists." If somebody says, "Oh, I think God exists. I think that God has very specific things that he commands me to do. He commands me not to do. But I don't think that gives me any sort of moral obligation. I think that maybe it gives me a self-interested reason to do these things, because God might reward me for doing them or punish me for not doing them, but I don't think it gives them any moral reason. I'm a nihilist about morality." Then any argument you could give against that would be exactly the same as an argument that an atheist could give against them. They're just separate questions. Like I think a really useful way of seeing that they're separate questions is to think about borrow a thought experiment from René Descartes in his Meditations a few hundred years ago, where he says, imagine that the world was created and is ruled over not by a kind and loving God, but by a wicked and cruel but all-powerful demon. And Descartes was making a point about knowledge, but we could run with it in a slightly different way and say, imagine that this all-powerful demon had created all the things that you think that God created: a physical world, a bunch of people to populate it, and an afterlife. And that the demon was going to reward people who tortured and killed innocents by sending them to heaven. He was going to punish people who had maybe helped try to save people from being tortured and killed by sending them to hell. Now, certainly in this world I'm describing, you would have a self-interested reason to to torture and kill and all that. But I hope we agree that it wouldn't be a moral reason. We wouldn't morally admire people who tortured and killed in order to get on the good side of the all-powerful demon. We wouldn't morally condemn people who...
Why not?
Well, again, any possible answer to that why not that you could give, I can give. There's nothing that theism adds to it. In fact, I would say we would morally admire people who knew about the demon much more if they were protecting innocents from being tortured and killed, knowing full well that this meant that they were, they were engaged in the ultimate act of self-sacrifice, that they were leaping into the eternal lake of fire. And it, again, this seems like if you think that relativism is a problem, if you think that it's bad to think that morality is just up to, the whims of a person, I don't see why it's any better to say that it's up to the whims of a different kind of being, if indeed it is up to their whims. If it's not up to their whims, then we seem to be in the other fork of the Euthyphro dilemma and say that there's something else that makes it good, which is the reason that God commands you to do it.
Okay, so I promise to jump over to the Euthyphro issue in 30 seconds, but I want to make one final point about our friend Stalin.
Yeah.
So if I'm talking to Stalin on his deathbed, and I'm talking to the Grand Inquisitor on his deathbed, and I step into their respective worlds, I say, Stalin, given your atheism, let's assume your atheism is correct. Well played, man. You got away with it. All right? If your atheism is correct, you pulled it off. If I'm on by the deathbed of the Grand Inquisitor and I step into his worldview, there is a God who is ultimate justice. I step into that worldview. What I say to the Grand Inquisitor is, boy, are you in trouble, man.
Okay, sure. But let's say let's make a third hypothetical that the Grand Inquisitor is right about what God wants. I would say what he's doing is no less morally loathsome because he happens to be right about what God wants. That would just make God not morally good. That wouldn't make the Grand Inquisitor.
So this gets us full tilt into the Euthyphro thing. So I'm there now. Happy to talk about it.
Awesome.
So if God if something is only right because God commands it, then you've got the problem of God commanding evil and wickedness and so on, which you're describing right there. But if God is commanding things because they're good, then that standard of goodness is outside God, and he is submitting to it. And that standard of goodness is the word of the true God. There's a God above a God. In other words, God is answerable to someone or something. If God is answerable to someone or something, then he's not God.
Well,
okay.
But hold on. Note that the response just assumes that morality must be God commanded, that the only place that morality can come from is being commanded by a God, which is exactly the issue and dispute right now. I mean, it just straightforward.
Right. So I wanted to
question.
You anticipated this at the tail end of your comments. I would want to say that God does that righteousness, holiness, goodness these are all attributes of God. They're simply descriptive of the way he is. So it's not something that he could have created maple trees with pink bark. He could have done something different there, but he couldn't have created a world in which squares were round or in which righteousness was unrighteous, because that would violate his own nature and character. God can do anything consistent with his own nature and character. And his own nature and character as a necessary being means that he does not submit to outside authority. He's not bound to a standard of good outside of himself, and he can't create a standard of good that's contrary to the way he is. So these things are, and the other thing is that God is not a contingent being. So he is what he is necessarily. That means God is not just holy. He is necessarily holy. It could not be otherwise. That means, because Christians confess that God is an absolute being, not a contingent being. He's absolutely a necessary being, and his attributes of justice and righteousness and kindness and love are eternal, just as he is. All that is in God is God. And so consequently, it's like, for me to try to imagine Descartes' demoniac God is like trying to imagine a Platonic form, a Platonic realm of the forms where all the squares were circular. It just doesn't work. I can't get my mind around it because God confesses, I am that I am. God is the way he is. And so consequently, morality is simply a reflection of his character. Christians want to conform themselves to the way God is.
So, but again, if you say that God can't be other than he is because God has eternally had this character, and it would be inconsistent for God not to have the character that he has, I don't really see how any of that makes it any harder to imagine a alternate world where, hey, maybe you don't want to call him God anymore because because at this point the being that we're imagining, maybe part of the necessary condition for counting as God is that he has that moral character. Fine, call him Schmod, right? So where Schmod exists, and Schmod is like God in every single way, except that his moral character is different. Instead of being steadfast, he's capricious. Instead of being, kind, he's cruel. And the question is, would that mean that those, in that world, would it be the case that cruelty was good because this happened to be the character of the being that created everything? And if not, why doesn't that mean that what counts as a morally good quality, a morally bad quality, a morally good character, a morally bad character, is independent of what character God has?
Right. I would say that what you're trying to do is you're asking me to visualize as a thought experiment something that I can't get my brain around. I can't imagine. If you're saying, imagine a world in which
it's not that hard.
Well, no, it's impossible for me. So you're asking me to imagine a world in which all the squares were circular, and I can't do it.
Well, I mean, first of all, I think, hey, Descartes was a believing Christian. He managed it. I think you should try. I think you should believe in yourself and try indeed to imagine it. I think you'll be able to imagine it. There's certainly nothing logically inconsistent about saying that you could have a world that was created and is ruled over by a being whose essential nature is to be.
No, because what you're asking me to do is deny an essential attribute of deity. So if you're asking me to defend the Christian God by imagining that he's finite.
Well, I mean, all I'm asking you to do, I'm not asking you to revise your view of how God actually is. All I'm asking you to do is presumably what you set out to do in your 3 points, which is to say, accept for the sake of argument something that you don't believe and see what follows from it. So that's what you're doing when you imagine that there is no God. You accept my presuppositions for the sake of argument. And that's also what you'd be doing if you imagined this thought experiment, and you said that rather than me being right, that there is neither a kind and loving God nor a cruel, omnipotent demon, or you being right, about there being a kind and loving God. I'm just asking you to temporarily accept and think about and see what follows from a third possible presupposition, which is that the world was created and is ruled by a all-powerful but cruel and capricious demon. And you're telling me that it's impossible, but I'm not really hearing a good reason why it is impossible. Okay. I'm not imagining.
I will give you this one.
Okay.
I'll go this far with you. Okay. For the sake of this discussion, as the Apostle Paul would say, I'm out of my mind to talk this way, but okay. All right. You've talked me into it. God is the infinite, all-powerful, omnipotent fiend. Okay, if that's the way the universe is, and you take your stand defying this ultimate power, like you postulated doing, I can say that given that cosmos, that rebellion of yours would be incoherent.
How would it be incoherent?
You'd have no reason for it.
Okay. Well, I'd have no self-interested reason for it, but I think ordinarily we think that moral reasons are deeply and profoundly different than self-interested reasons.
But what reason can you point to? What reason?
Again,
what would you? What would you point to?
Yeah, like a moral reason is a reason that you're doing something because it's morally right. You're not doing something because you're morally wrong. So Kant, for example, would say that an action has moral worth precisely to the extent that it is not motivated by self-interest. Now, he thinks it has to be motivated by respect for the
scene God would say, what do you,
I
the
would
scene God would say to you,
I'd say that
why are you listening to Kant? I killed him.
Well, I think that I would say that as powerful as this demon is, that he's not a very clear thinker because he's confusing two different issues. The demon is asking me what self-interested reason that I have. I'm talking about moral reasons, and moral reasons begin precisely where self-interested reasons end. That's why, like Plato in the Republic, he's asking people to consider, to figure out what they really think is morally just, to imagine a ring of invisibility so you could do whatever you wanted and get away with it. Says, what would you not do because you think it's morally wrong? What he's trying to do is he's trying to separate out the issue of what you're going to be
so morally
rewarded.
My question is morally wrong. Morally wrong by what standard? By what standard?
Morally wrong by the standards of objectively correct morality, which again, I think there are arguments for all of the options that I've given for objectively correct morality. Now, if you don't find any of those arguments convincing, if you say no, I think that all of those options are wrong. I think that maybe there's a deep philosophical problem with making sense of the very thought of objective morality. Then all I would say to you is, okay, but if that's true, if there is this big problem with how to make sense of the idea of morality being objective, adding on, well, God exists to your set of assumptions is going to do exactly nothing to alleviate that problem. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.